Morgan Spector stars in the second season of The Gilded Age on HBO. I'm David Buchanan with Gold Derby. Morgan, I have to start by asking you, I feel like this season was so rich for George,
Mm.
between the union struggles, his quarrel with Bertha, the opera wars. I mean, so much wonderful material. When you saw those scripts and heard from Julian the direction of season two, what were you most excited to tackle?
Um, I was definitely really excited to tackle the union stuff just because I feel like that's part of it's like such a rich part of the history of this period. And it was so dramatic. I mean, it was incredibly violent. I mean, one of the reasons, there's this perennial sort of historical question like about America, why don't we have a labor party? And part of the reason is that when unions did try to organize, they were violently suppressed in the US in a way that they really weren't in other countries. I mean, there were violent struggles, but it was much bloodier here. And both the sort of forces of capital and the state were willing to combine and use violence. So I was excited about that, just because it's sort of I think it's under discussed U.S. history, um, and also because George often runs up against George mostly has an answer for the problems that he comes across, but workers withholding their labor is one of those things that you just, at a certain point, if they're willing to go as far as if they're willing to go all the way and be hungry and go without, like it's hard to beat them. And especially if they're willing to fight your scabs. So anyway, I was interested in that for all of those reasons. Um, and yeah, I mean the other stuff was exciting too, but that was the main thing I was jazzed about.
Yeah, I feel like what's so great about that whole arc is you have to walk such a fine line between I think the audience loves George. He's so endearing, such a wonderful figure, but he also has to be really ruthless in these
Yeah.
negotiations. How do you kind of see him in relation to the other kind of robber barons like the Jay Goulds? I know he was based on Jay Gould when Julian was writing, the
Yeah.
first season. How do you think he is different from those others? Because I do feel like, he stands out amongst the pack.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have the audience, and I watched the show, so I hope that I can have some perspective on it from the perspective of the audience. But I think we have an access to George when we're watching the show, like to his intimate life, to his private life, and the way he cares about his daughter, the way he cares about his wife. And so that gives us a dimensionality to how we perceive him. That if you look at historical accounts of these figures, especially in the newspaper, like contemporaneous newspaper accounts, that was often not included. I mean, Jay Gould, he had this wonderful orchid collection, and he was very invested in his family. Uh, but he was really kind of, I mean, I don't want to say this is unfair because it probably wasn't. And if it was, he could certainly bear it. But he was really scapegoated for the kind of capitalism that prevailed in the late 19th century. He was the face, he was the villainous face of it. And he had this long beard. And, certainly as he was caricatured in the press at the time, these sort of Semitic features. And though he was not Jewish. And so he became, um, yeah, he became kind of the face of that. And I think, you know, George, because we see all these other aspects of his character, we don't. I think he's not necessarily seen as like a pure villain, even though he can do certainly nasty things. And I think as you were sort of alluding to at the beginning of the question, like there is a delicate balancing act there because I think it would be possible for George to go too far, and at a certain point, viewers would sort of think, okay, yeah, he's a nice dad and he's a good husband and stuff, but who cares? Like he's now gone too far for me. And so I think it's a challenge, being true to who this person would have been and how he would have perceived workers and how he would have perceived, how he would have operated at the time, but also not making him so vile that we can't, enjoy the other things.
Yeah, that's what's great about those scenes you have with Darren Goldstein as Henderson. Such an interesting foil for George this year because I think they do really respect each other. They're obviously coming from very different places, but how do you think George kind of reads him? I mean, he's obviously a very savvy character, really speaks for those workers and represents them so well. And he's obviously, as I said, very savvy and sharp. He has a good read on George. What's George's read on Henderson?
I mean, I guess the way I sort of think about it in playing these scenes is that for George, as a strategic thinker, um, personal animus is like an emotional cloud that he doesn't need and can't afford. And so he sort of, I think, just sits in his structural position and articulates the incentives of that position. And so, and I think he has what I've heard called cognitive empathy. So he can sort of put himself in the position of the other person and say, if I'm in this structural position, these are my incentives, and this is what I want. And he has, when Henderson articulates those so clearly, I think he respects it. I mean, he opposes it, but I don't think there's a later scene when it's really gotten down to the wire, and Henderson is still insisting on his position, that I think George does get frustrated, and George does say, "Look, you don't have the leverage you think you have here. Maybe you will eventually, but today you don't. You will lose eventually. So let's just cut to the part where you lose and make a deal." Um, and to the extent that I think in George's, I mean, George is obviously trying to win. He's trying to, continue to extract surplus labor value from these workers. But I think he is also trying to not have the potential for bloodshed. And I think Henderson realizes that being willing to shed a little blood is part of what gives them leverage. And the situation gets dangerous, more and more dangerous over the course of the season.
Yeah, let's dive into that sixth episode where you have that standoff with Henderson. An incredible scene. I mean, all those scenes in that episode. First, you're visiting Henderson's house and you get to meet the family. That seems to really affect George. What is it about meeting those kids, especially the son who says, I'm starting to work at the mill? The way you play it, that really seems to impact George more than anything Henderson has said thus far. What is it about that dynamic that really speaks to him?
I mean, I think, it's, I remember in whatever it was, 2016, when Donald Trump got elected, everyone was like, I don't know anyone who voted for Donald Trump. Everyone was like, we live in bubbles. We don't, we are insulated by class and race and all of these things that determine where our relationships are. And if you are the equivalent of a billionaire, I imagine that is even more extreme. So George just doesn't meet people who are in the social position that Henderson's family is in. So I think there is something genuinely just shocking when he's exposed to how modest their lives are and how difficult their lives are. And I also think he knows what it's like in his factories. He can pretend that he doesn't. He can argue from a position of saying, well, this is what you've signed up for. This is personal responsibility, etc. But he knows people are being injured in those factories. Um, and for a 13-year-old kid to be in that position, he's a father. He knows what 13-year-olds are like and what their capacities are. And I think there is, yeah, I think there's just, it becomes real for him, what it means for him to continue to create these conditions. And that becomes, although he doesn't sort of articulate that this is why this happens, but the area where he gives the most in the ultimate deal is on working conditions. He won't give on wages, but he becomes very concerned about worker safety. And I think that, if for him it's that little kid. That kid is the reason that he doesn't want those workers fired upon, and that kid is the reason that he wants to change the circumstances in his factory. And it's certainly a failing of George's that he's not had the imagination before to understand that these conditions needed to be changed. But for whatever reason, I think that's what it took. It took him seeing that kid and really imagining that person going through that experience.
Before we talk about Bertha and those great scenes, I do just want to ask you about the production on that standoff scene. Take us to the shooting of that, because I mean, you're on location. There's a lot of background performers. Just what was it like to shoot that? It's so intense to watch. I mean, how much fun was it to get to do that?
Well, it was funny. I mean, not so, there's an inequality on set between actors who are principal performers and background actors who are getting paid a very, a day rate that is, fair, established by the union as a floor. But man, is it not what, there's a huge difference there between what they're getting and what we're getting. And they, on that day, they were all, because of the way where the sun was when we were shooting. Oh yeah, can you see my? I had to do it. Um, where the sun was when we were shooting meant that we were in the shade and they were all standing in the sun. And they were standing there for hours and hours screaming at the top of their lungs. And we were just, all we had to do was like roll out, walk up on this cart and be like, nah, don't kill them, and then walk back in. So the sort of like, I don't know, the structural injustices that exist and persist all around us in our contemporary lives were very present on that day. Um, so that was one aspect of it. It was also just, I think, the production design, the costumes, everything was beautifully rendered by our craftspeople. It was, I think the scene was, it's anytime you get to do something that's of that scope, I think it's always really exciting. Um, and, but yeah, then I was also, so yeah, that it was a great day in that way. I thought everyone involved, all those background actors did a brilliant job. You felt their rage the entire time that they were shooting, and there was a reality to that. It was they were being forced to do this thing that is hard. They were hot, they were thirsty, they were standing there for hours. That's what they signed up for. But man, that sucks. Those days suck, and they stayed mad. It was cool. And then what I found really gratifying was that in the episode, uh, Crystal Roberson, or in the edit, managed to give them the win in a really satisfying way. Like when George yields, at least temporarily, I don't know, it was really thrilling. And when we were watching it, it was post-strike. When we were shooting, it was pre-strike, obviously, and we were watching, it was post, SAG and writer strike. And yeah, I actually found it very moving to watch, when it in the way it actually came out in the ultimate edit.
Yeah, it is incredibly moving, and it sounds like the conditions really gave some realism to that. I mean, just incredible. Okay, let's talk about working with Carrie Coon. You've obviously got your wonderful Bertha shirt on,
Hmm.
which I love. Your rapport off screen seems brilliant. Your rapport on screen is incredible. And this season, we actually get to see them probably quarreling the worst that we've seen before. Um,
Mhm.
I want to start with that scene where we see that Winterton is actually Turner,
Yeah.
because we focus on Carrie's reaction and Bertha's reaction, which is so calibrated, but George must be thinking some not good thoughts too, because he knows that there's this secret
Yeah.
between them. Take us inside, like what is George thinking in that moment while we're watching Bertha? What's the calculation in George's head?
Yeah. I mean, I think we did a few different takes, but I wrestle with this idea because I do think George doesn't think Turner is that significant, and I do think that he does believe that the way he handled the situation, it's handled. It's somebody made him an offer, he said no. Like, he did the right thing. It's over. Um, and But yes, I also think somewhere in the back of his mind, he was like, I left a time bomb in my own life, and now here it is. Uh, so yes, that I mean, when in the ultimate playing of it, um, just the sense of, okay, this person who I thought I had disposed of is now in our lives in a completely different way. Um, yeah, it's just wildly uncomfortable. Yeah.
Yeah, and then that bomb does go off in the next episode where Bertha confronts George in the library. Such a wonderful scene, so well played
Nice.
by the two of you. Um, how did you and Carrie approach that? I mean, there's so many different ways that could have gone, but I think what's so powerful about it is how raw Bertha is. We never see her that unguarded,
Yeah.
and George, has to kind of respond in kind, and it's very wounding. How did you two explore like exactly how to play that? Because it's just pitch perfect.
Thank you. Well, I guess there were a couple of things. One is, when you need a performance that is raw and unguarded, Carrie has a capacity to just take it all down and let you see her pain that I think is really rare and powerful. Um, and so when you're playing opposite that, you know, you have something very real and palpable just to deal with, just to handle, to absorb and respond to. So there's that. there's also what I was sort of struggling with was to try to stay out of my own contemporary response and in a period appropriate response from the perspective of someone who feels like, actually, I didn't really do anything wrong here. Like, I did the fucking right thing and I was looking out for you at the time. And I think what George fails to understand is that it's not the deflected infidelity that she's upset about. It's the somebody else has knowledge about me. Have you ever seen the Tom Stoppard play The Real Thing? He has this whole discussion of carnal knowledge that, it's like, this is why infidelity is so painful, because somebody else has knowledge about your partner that you don't have. And your belief was that, prior to this act of infidelity, was that you knew everything there was to know about this person in that arena. And I think that's what that moment it really is that there's this betrayal of trust, and that's what really makes their relationship remarkable, is that they do have this trust. And I think George truly made a mistake. He truly unwittingly made a mistake in that regard, out of his desire to sort of make this matter as little as possible. Um, and so, yeah, like not being like not letting myself be as affected as I actually was by Carrie's emotional state was kind of the challenge of that scene. And sort of staying in George's like genuine indignance. But yeah, it was fun. It was a hard scene to play, because weirdly, usually I love playing conflict. But with George and Bertha, their togetherness is so fun to play. Like, their marriage works so well that suddenly being like, how do they fight? Like, when it really goes to shit, like, what's that like? So it was, yeah, it was tricky.
I have a feeling we're going to see more conflict between them next season because of the way I mean, I think the ending of this season is just so wonderful, because we know, the audience knows what Bertha has done with Gladys and the Duke, what it cost her to get him to that opening, which he may be not even needed to come to because she had this triumph anyway. But how much do you think, I love the way you play those final moments, because you're asking her, well, what exactly, how did you get him to come? I don't know, like, the way your expression, I don't know if we are seeing it dawn on George fully. Like, how much do you think he puts together in that moment? And how much is that going to inflect what happens in season 3?
I guess what I was thinking at the time was like, I was still trying to give her the benefit of the doubt, basically, because obviously he has taken a really strong position on this, and for her to just, she's sort of saying, "Oh, let me handle this. This is my area." It's like, no, 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 no. Like, you're not gonna. The other thing is, we're at the opera. It's her night. It's a great triumph. He doesn't want to take anything away from that, but I think it's definitely sort of something that, as soon as they're in the carriage at the end of that evening, they're getting into it. Is sort of how I felt about it. Yeah.
Before I let you go, Morgan, I asked Carrie when I spoke to her, there's so many incredible actors on this show.
Mm.
And a lot of you don't get to interact. There's so many stories. Who would you in season 3 most like to spend more time on screen with, that maybe you haven't had any scenes with or have had limited interaction with?
Well, Danae's world, Peggy's world, is so separate from ours that if we could figure out a way that made sense for us to collide there, I think that would be really fascinating and just surprising. And you would go, I don't know, it would be one of those things where you go, it would be tricky to make work, but I would just love to do some work with Danae, and haven't gotten to. Um, and also, Ben Allers has now invented the world's greatest alarm clock and is going into business with Larry. So it's like, maybe that'll happen. Maybe we'll get to do a little you know, um, entrepreneurial investor startup kind of business, which would be fun.
That'd be great. Maybe Bertha could use Peggy for some correspondence, like Agnes does.
Yeah.
Morgan Spector, congratulations on the 2nd season of the Gilded Age. Thank you so much for talking to Gold Derby today.
Thanks, Dave. It's been a pleasure.